What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you all of the BioWare RPGs that I have reviewed ranked. Recently I did a video about all of the CRPG reviews I've done and ranking them, and a lot of people were asking about some of the BioWare titles I've reviewed previously that I didn't really consider CRPGs, and that got me thinking that it would be fun to make a video like this, ranking almost all of BioWare's games since I've played and reviewed almost all of them. 12 of them, to be specific. I've played a couple more than that, though they do have one or two I've never touched, such as their first game, Shattered Steel, and a couple of the mobile game things. And then games like their Star Wars MMO, The Old Republic, I have played, but obviously I wouldn't review that, as I largely stick to single-player games these days. And then I've played a little bit of Anthem, but I don't think anybody needs my review on that one at this point. Now, another thing I wanted to mention here at the beginning is that I actually like pretty much every game on this list, which is part of the fun in ranking them for me, is because I like all of them so much that ranking them was actually very difficult, because I'm a huge fan of most of them, actually. There's a couple I'm pretty neutral about, to be honest. While people will inevitably disagree with some of my choices, I'm sure. This is the kind of video you kind of hear the pitchforks being gathered as you think about making it. But I think it's worth mentioning that I enjoy pretty much every one of these games on some level. And if you want my full thoughts on any of these titles, again, I've reviewed all of them. Feel free to go watch the review, as we're going to be moving pretty quickly through these here. But with no further ado, let's actually jump into this thing. And first on our list, thus at the bottom, is Mass Effect Andromeda. Now, while I can safely say this is my least favorite BioWare game, as I mentioned in my review, I don't think it's as bad as people make it out to be. For instance, I find the combat of Mass Effect Andromeda to be very fun, actually. I think it had a lot of potential that was unfortunately a bit unrealized. But ultimately, I think what happened with Andromeda is that it was an average game in a series that had been pretty exceptional up to that point. And as such, it kind of doesn't feel like a Mass Effect game. But nonetheless, like I said, there are things I enjoyed about it. Driving the Nomad around was a lot of fun, and the combat was genuinely a good time. But that brings us to our second lowest ranking, and this is actually Dragon Age 2. Dragon Age 2 is definitely my least favorite Dragon Age game. However, it does still have some things going for it. It's one of my favorite cast of characters in terms of companions for a game. I really enjoyed the experience of seeing them throughout different points of their life and how they kind of grew and changed over the years. And that's something I really appreciated about Dragon Age 2. However, it is pretty hard to ignore the glaring issues with the constantly reused assets and dungeons, the combat that feels pretty bad on normal, to be honest. On higher difficulties, it actually has some tactical elements to it where you have to be more aware of the things you're doing, but unlike normal, it's a very spammy action game that doesn't really feel right for Dragon Age. And the giant shift away from what Dragon Age Origins was left kind of a weird place for Dragon Age 2 to be. And as such, it's pretty low on the list. Third from the bottom, we have Mass Effect 3. I enjoyed a lot of Mass Effect 3, but I do think it's the weakest Mass Effect game. On one hand, it was really nice seeing the conclusion of all of your decisions up to that point. However, it ran into a lot of problems, especially at launch, as I'm sure many people are aware, with the endings. But even after the endings got fleshed out, there were still some plot holes that made the whole thing feel like a bit of a rush job. But luckily, in spite of that, Mass Effect 3 still has some greatly redeeming qualities. For instance, the Citadel DLC is a great bit of fan service, really, that I enjoyed a great deal. And a lot of the cumulative gameplay improvements up to that point were really shining in Mass Effect 3, but nonetheless still kind of low on the list. Fourth from the bottom, we have Jade Empire. I actually like Jade Empire quite a bit. I think the reason it's so low in comparison to all of the others, honestly, is that it feels a lot more dated than almost everything on this list. Even the CRPGs, which we're going to talk about from the 90s, because those saw enhanced editions, whereas Jade Empire is a bit of a rough experience even to this day. If you buy it on Steam, it actually won't work unless you go change some files, for instance, which leads to a bad experience before you even fire the game up. Luckily, the actual game is quite fun. It's a really cool story. There's a lot of martial arts combat, obviously, but there's all sorts of styles you can get to customize your character. There's options for quests. And while I really like a lot of what they did with Jade Empire, the fact that they cut a ton of the RPG mechanics, and the fact that they never really bothered to expand any farther than just the base Jade Empire, makes it pretty low, though I did enjoy the experience quite a bit, in spite of those things. Moving on, though, then we have Mass Effect 1. Mass Effect 1, of course, being the game that introduced us to the Mass Effect universe via video games. One thing I really enjoyed about Mass Effect was the feeling that you were stepping into a complete universe, if you will. The entire system around the Citadel and the Council and all the lore around all these other species that we've encountered felt very fleshed out. Combine that with this being the most RPG of all the Mass Effect games, even if it was honestly still pretty trimmed down, and I found it to be a pretty enjoyable experience. However, my main problem with Mass Effect was that it really lacked a lot of expansion in some key areas. Like, they tried some things, but the execution was off. And I think the biggest example of this is driving around on the Mako, where you'd just be on these big empty planets where there was essentially nothing forever, and the driving wasn't really that fun. But while it's certainly getting a little bit dated at this point, I did nonetheless really enjoy the RPG mechanics and the things they tried and the world that it introduced me to. So Mass Effect 1's kind of middle of the road for me. And that brings us to number 6, and this is the original Neverwinter Nights. As I mentioned in another video recently, Neverwinter Nights is a really difficult game to place on a rankings list, because while there is a main campaign and everything, really Neverwinter Nights is more of a platform for user-created content than it is an actual game. And because of all that user-created content, you could get literally thousands of hours out of Neverwinter Nights with a variety of experiences that could be anything from terrible to the best thing you've ever played, which means that my experience with Neverwinter is going to be a bit different from someone else's, especially when you take into account the user-created content. And that's before we even really start talking about Persistent Worlds, which were like little private server MMOs that are still going to this day because Neverwinter Nights received an enhanced edition. That said, though, while I really love the idea and what Neverwinter Nights represents in that regard, it is nonetheless, even with the enhanced edition, very dated. It looks very clunky, and the actual official content, if you will, is mostly just average, with the expansions being pretty good. Hence, again, middle of the road, gets some extra points for the amazing community support though. And that brings us to number 7 with Knights of the Old Republic. Big fan of Star Wars, and it's really a big shame that we have not seen more of these proper RPGs from that franchise, because it's the kind of thing that would fit perfectly in that universe, in my opinion. Which is why I think games like KOTOR are so highly regarded. Now, BioWare specifically really only made the first one, and while it is one of the most dated games on this list, to be sure, it's still a really great experience. I enjoyed it quite a bit. The story around Revan and everything is honestly just fantastic, even if some of the writing around things like the Jedi and how they handle their problems is a little ridiculous. But just above that entry, we have Dragon Age Origins. Now, I am absolutely on the record of being of the opinion that Dragon Age Origins is a bit overrated. However, even I would be remiss to tell you that it is not one of BioWare's best games, because it is. And at the end of the day, it is a pretty deep RPG with tons of choice, plenty of consequences, and a very rewarding experience as a result. And some of my favorite parts are the origin stories, which I thought were all very cool. Personally, my favorite was the Mage Circle one. However, Human Noble and the Dwarven Noble one were also very cool. These days, Dragon Age Origins is also getting very dated, and honestly, I would love to see it get remastered or something. I think that would be amazing. Especially since a lot of the problems with Dragon Age Origins now are really around the sort of clunky mechanics. Though personally, what I love about Dragon Age just across the board is the lore and the setting. I really enjoy the universe that they created, and Dragon Age Origins was, of course, kind of our big introduction to that. The origin story, if you will. So while I think people tend to exaggerate how good it is still nonetheless very, very good. And then fourth from the top, we have Baldur's Gate 2. Baldur's Gate 2 is a great game, one of the biggest CRPGs there is, which of course sees us facing off with Irenicus, who is a fantastic villain, but more than anything, I actually really enjoyed a lot of the exploring in BG2, a lot of the things revolving around the strongholds, and all of the side content that you can participate in. There's even some missable content based on the choices you make, and overall, it's a ton of fun, and with the expansion, Throne of Baal, it's really cool to see the finale of this giant epic story that your character went through. However, it does have some faults. For me, I really don't like high-level advanced Advanced Dungeons and Dragons combat. It's a little dull, honestly. It's a lot of stripping off protections to then attack the enemy, and it gets a little bland pretty quick for me, which is funny because I did actually love just about everything else about BG2. And thankfully, with the Enhanced Edition, it's more playable than it ever has been, since its release anyway. However, it's still a bit of a clunky situation. I've actually made a huge guide for it and one about how to approach Advanced Dungeons and Dragons if you're unfamiliar with it. So if you're thinking about checking it out before BG3, you absolutely should. But that brings us to the third from the top, and it is Mass Effect 2. I really enjoy Mass Effect 2. I think this was probably the best iteration of the Mass Effect games in my opinion, where it was kind of focused on these action sequences and then having conversations and making choices, and it kind of honed in on the main experience that they were going for. And as a result of cutting a lot of the superfluous stuff from the first game, I think it actually found a really good place to be in. While I personally prefer more RPG style things in terms of, stats, mechanics, more complicated combat rather than the action focus, even I have to admit that Mass Effect 2 does what it does very, very well. Combine that with all the decisions and loyalty missions leading up to the suicide mission, which can then play out very differently based on your choices, or lack thereof in some cases, and it's a really fantastic experience that builds off of the first game in terms of its mechanics. Now, the weak parts of the game are that the narrative kind of feels like whatever. It's kind of the middle ground. The collectors seems kind of like more of a background threat that they're using as a MacGuffin just to give you something to do, honestly. So the actual main story does feel a bit weaker in comparison to the other two. But the companions are great. I loved the approach, even if I don't really consider this one as heavy of an RPG as I typically enjoy. And that brings us to number 2 on the list, the one that I can absolutely hear people grabbing their pitchforks and torches about, and that is Dragon Age Inquisition. I really enjoy Dragon Age Inquisition, and much to the annoyance of many people, I like it more than I like Dragon Age Origins. However, Dragon Age Inquisition absolutely has some pretty glaring faults, and I think the biggest of those is the hinterlands by far. I think the way that game begins with the opening area, the hinterlands, is really bad. They throw way too much at you all at once, people get lost in the weeds, and then they just quit because they don't want to do it. However, if you can get past that and play the entire game, I think Inquisition has a lot going on, and I enjoyed it. It's far from perfect, honestly. It's definitely a game that really should have reined in its scope. I think it has way too many fetch quests and boring side content, but despite those things, I enjoyed it a lot. I enjoyed managing the Inquisition, seeing it affect landscapes, watching the areas change as I went through them. I loved the big cinematic dragon fights. I loved a lot of the companions. There's just a lot about Dragon Age Inquisition that I really enjoyed, and so it is very high on the list, though I do admit it is absolutely a flawed game. And I can definitely see other people putting it on the very bottom of their list. But that brings us to the number 1 spot. And if you watch this channel a lot, I really don't think that's much of a surprise, and that is Baldur's Gate 1. I really enjoy Baldur's Gate 1. In some ways, it's absolutely inferior to Baldur's Gate 2, but there are just things about Baldur's Gate 1 that really feel right to me. For instance, it feels more like exploring a world when you're running around the first Baldur's Gate, because all of the maps are kind of connected and you move from one to the next, and it feels like you're actually traversing a world as opposed to just jumping around spots on a map. Combine this with my preference for the earlier content in terms of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons combat and the sort of mystery around everything going on with the iron shortage and the Iron Throne causing that shortage, and then everything that goes down with Saravok. It's just a classic tale that I really, really enjoy. Part of which I'm absolutely sure is spurned by memories of playing it when I was much, much younger. Nonetheless, it is absolutely my favorite BioWare game, and it is from 1998. But that, guys, is all of my rankings for the BioWare games I have reviewed, which is most of them. But by all means, I'd love to hear how you would rank things. I'm sure people will have things to say about the Dragon Age Inquisition ranking. At the very least, I'm very curious to see how everyone else would rank them, so absolutely leave that down below. Like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.